Camino is written and directed by Vince Gilligan and stars Aaron Paul as Jesse Pinkman once again in this continuation of the Breaking Bad story 6 years after the show finished. For those of you that aren't aware, Breaking Bad is my favourite TV show of all time. Some shows have come close, but at the end of the day, Breaking Bad will always take that title. What it was able to accomplish in terms of storytelling and characters is still mind-blowing to this day. The fact that small little details in seasons 1 and 2 would have much bigger consequences in, say, seasons 4 or 5 is just so brilliant, and the way everything perfectly fit into place was just brilliant to watch unfold, and the fact that you could see these pieces fitting into place as the show went on was just brilliant to watch. Which is why, when they announced a film that was going to carry on Breaking Bad, I was very skeptical, especially when it was first announced, because that season finale of Breaking Bad is genuinely perfect in my opinion. The way it rounds everything off and puts everything to sleep, so to speak, was just so good. I genuinely don't know how they could have carried it on. Yes, there was one main unanswered question from that ending, and for those of you that haven't seen Breaking Bad, first of all, what the fuck are you doing? Watch Breaking Bad. But yeah, the one unanswered question in the series finale of Breaking Bad, spoiler alert, is what happened to Jesse Pinkman? And yeah, I was thinking that too for a little bit, but to be honest, I loved how it ended so much that I didn't care about that question as much. But we now have El Camino to fill in that gap, and I've got to say, I'm still having trouble thinking about this film, because even though it is nice to see these characters back, especially Jesse Pinkman, there is still something about this movie that feels like it doesn't really need to happen. Like, yes, it is nice to see what happened, but in the end, I'm just kind of like, did we really need to see that? My first positive with El Camino is that it's just genuinely nice to be back in the world of Breaking Bad. Everything from the style to the direction immediately puts you back in that world. Everything from the time-lapse footage to the way certain shots are executed just feels like Breaking Bad again, and it is nice to be back in this world again. And that is probably the best thing I can give this movie, alongside Aaron Paul's performance, which is genuinely brilliant. You can tell he's having a blast in this movie, and he's never left this character. Like, this character's always been there, and he just perfectly slips back into the shoes of Jesse Pinkman so well. He is so brilliant in this movie. But yeah, that and the fact that this movie looks and feels like Breaking Bad, just slightly more polished, really does a good job of keeping you engaged, because from the word go, you feel like you're back in the world of Breaking Bad, and it's just really nice to see. Weirdly enough, there were a few moments in Breaking Bad itself that did feel very Western-y, like especially in terms of how it was shot and how some of the storylines played out. There were certain aspects to it that felt like it was a Western, but they never fully delved into that subgenre at all until El Camino. El Camino kind of fully embraces that Western side of things, like not to the point where, you know, they're wearing cowboy hats and riding fucking horses. It doesn't get that far, but there are definitely certain aspects that lean more towards like a neo-Western vibe. Like, for example, there's even a duel at one point, and the way certain things play out, everything just feels a lot more tense, and it just feels like you're watching a Western more than a Breaking Bad thing, even though it looks and feels like Breaking Bad. And I thought that was a nice way they went about it, because that kind of leads into my next thing. There's not much action in the movie, but when the action does happen in the film, it feels very cathartic, I think the word is, because especially from the perspective of Jesse's character, it feels cathartic anyway. So yeah, there isn't much action in the movie, but when it happens, it is very satisfying, and that kind of leads into the whole Western tone, which they've definitely leaned a lot heavier, in this movie than they ever did back when it was Breaking Bad. Now, my one main issue with El Camino is probably something that kind of couldn't be helped at this point, and it's some of the actors. The actors are all good in the movie, don't get me wrong, the acting is brilliant in this film. But you've got to take into account, it's been 6 years since the show ended, and this film has a few recurring characters from the show. Aaron Paul looks virtually the same. He hasn't aged that much since 2013. However, there are a couple of actors in this movie that have either aged quite drastically since 2013 or have physically changed since that time. And the fact that this movie is supposed to take place literally minutes after the events of season 5, that sense of continuity feels very broken because a lot of these actors do not look the same. There is one actor in particular, and I won't say who it is because you could deem it as a spoiler, the fact that he's in the movie in the first place, but there is one actor in particular that looks completely different to how he did back in 2013. And yes, it is nice to see that person back in this, world again. But the fact that that is supposed to be the same person literally at the exact same point when the show finished, I just can't believe that. He looks so different from how he did back then. And there are a few other people that fall into this category as well. And unfortunately, that was my one major nitpick with El Camino, especially for anyone who's deciding to binge this movie straight after watching the whole of Breaking Bad. Like, going from all 5 seasons of Breaking Bad straight into El Camino, you're going to notice that difference, and it's going to be jarring. And that's why there are certain aspects of this movie that didn't quite work for me, purely because that sense of continuity was slightly broken. Yes, they could have maybe done a de-aging thing with some of these people, but again, I don't know whether that would have worked. So you're kind of just stuck in this odd rut where you have these actors that look older than they're supposed to be, but they're supposed to be playing the same people that they played 6 years ago at that exact same time. It's very weird. If you've seen El Camino, you'll know exactly what I'm on about. And yes, it is very jarring when you see it. The other thing I wanted to say about El Camino is that even though as you're watching this movie, it has a lot of satisfying moments, especially in the long term in terms of the way characters were played out in Breaking Bad, there are definitely some very satisfying moments and satisfying character interactions. One moment in particular that did make me choke up a little bit, that was really well executed. And even though you feel like that during the movie, after the film is finished, you do start thinking to yourself, did we really need that? Yes, it was good while I was watching it, and yes, it did feel worthwhile as I was watching it. But in the long term, was this really necessary? And that's the one thing I keep thinking to myself about El Camino. Yes, it is nice to see these characters again, and yes, it is nice to be back in this world again in a familiar way, but was it really necessary? In the end, El Camino, I think, barely scrapes an 8 out of 10. I was going to give it a 7.5, but I do think certain aspects like the direction, the writing, and especially the acting bump it up to an 8. I'm not quite sure at this point, but I'm kind of happy sticking it at an 8 at this point. But yeah, like I said, El Camino is a very well executed movie that might not particularly be necessary, but definitely feels fulfilling in the moment. So guys, that was my review of El Camino. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want me to review the whole of Breaking Bad at some point, please let me know in the comments because I would happily oblige with that. If you like the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Bye.